All right, so ultimately, which method are you going to use? Well, in many respects, it depends on what you're more comfortable with. There are different ways to collect information about a topic, but each method has benefits and limitations. When beginning a research project, it's important to consider which method will work best for you. Sometimes the researchers will collect data using more than one method. This is called, of course, mixed methods approach. If your research shows the same trends when you use multiple kinds of methods, it increases the likelihood that your conclusions are correct. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you just don't have the money, nor the time, nor the inclination to do a mixed method approach. And so one of the first big decisions that you're going to have to make in your research is what method are you the most comfortable with, and how are you going to use it. One qualitative methodology is ethnography or participant observation. So one way to collect data is through ethnography, or studying people in their own environments in order to understand the meanings that they give to their activities. Ethnography literally means writing culture, which happens when researchers collect their observations and write about their experiences in a scientific way. Participant observation is another form of this qualitative methodology, and in participant observation, the researcher both observes and becomes a member of the social setting. Say, for instance, you want to study a particular church. One of the best ways to study that church might be to conduct an ethnographic study where you go to that church for the services and participate in church activities. In a sense, this gives you a bird's eye view into the inner workings of that organization. It usually requires that you inform the organization that you'll be collecting data while you're there. So whether you are studying a group or you're participating as you study the group, this form of qualitative methods might be your best bet. Ethnography usually happens in two steps. The researcher participates in and observes a setting and/or observes a setting. Then the researcher makes a written account by taking field notes of what goes on there. Ethnographers aim to provide a thick description of the setting they observe. It's important to take a thorough and precise set of field notes when conducting an ethnographic study. Leaving something out because it doesn't seem important to you can result in incomplete data. Every detail is and needs to be equally important, and recording these details properly allows the researcher to draw conclusions at the end of the study. Thus, writing field notes can be very time-consuming, but extremely important as you try to construct this thick and rich description of the events that transpired when you were out in the field. A sociologist may conduct an autoethnography, which is a type of participant observation that focuses on the feelings and actions of the researcher itself. We have to continue to remember that we are and we become part of the process, and we're impacting and affecting the research itself. We are making an impact, and so studying those impacts probably benefits us in our ability to come to good conclusions. Another important part of the process is interviews. Interviews involve direct face-to-face contact with respondents. They can generate large amounts of qualitative data, of course, and a researcher identifies the target population of interest, then selects a sample of people to be interviewed from that population. So using the strength of good sampling will allow for you to then generalize to a larger population. Of course, interviews can take a long time to complete, but they can produce very rich data. In fact, in an interview, a respondent might say something that the researcher had not previously considered, which can help focus the research project in other ways, in ways that you might not have thought were important to begin with. Researchers have to be careful not to lead the respondent into certain kinds of answers by asking questions, what we might call leading questions, like, you really like eating vegetables, don't you? Instead, researchers should allow the respondent to answer freely by asking questions like, how do you feel about eating vegetables? One's a leading question, one isn't a leading question. Of course, in the realm of interviews, you have open-ended interviews and closed-ended interviews, and questions that fit both styles. Interviews can be used in an open-ended way or a closed-ended way. Open-ended questions let respondents talk as much as they'd like about the questions you ask, whereas closed-ended questions give respondents a choice of answers. An open-ended question allows the answer to take whatever form the respondent chooses. As an example, what do you think about couples living together before they are married? The respondent can give lots of information, examples, and personal experiences, all of which could provide valuable data to the researcher. And this method does take a lot of time, though the time is well spent. A closed-ended question imposes limits on the responses themselves. For example, are you for or against couples living together before they are married? The question doesn't have an option for a middle ground. Respondents are forced to say, yes, I'm for, or no, I am not for. So you can see how the question itself is going to allow for the respondent to expound upon something, or it's going to restrict them in how they answer the questions. Another important tool in methods are surveys. Surveys are questionnaires that are administered to a sample of respondents selected from a target population. Sociologists often use probability sampling to obtain a sample that reflects the characteristics of members of the target population. And survey research tends to look at large-scale social patterns and employs statistics and other mathematical means of analysis. As you can imagine, this is generally used in quantitative methodologies. Surveys are relatively easy to create and to administer. However, they are generally closed-ended. You can't have a dialogue with a respondent in a survey. Therefore, answers will be direct and usually concise. It's easy to collect a lot of data this way, but the scope of the responses are going to be somewhat limited. Researchers are increasingly using the internet for survey research rather than the traditional methods of in-person and by mail. This might be helping response rates. It might not be helping response rates, but it's certainly something different than we have done in the past. And then, of course, there's some issues with survey research. Nobody wants to take a survey. Somebody calls you up and says, I'm doing a poll on a Friday night. Most people aren't even going to answer that question. Most people aren't even going to answer the phone. And they're certainly not going to participate in such a way that gives us confidence in extrapolating what we found in those surveys to a larger population. Another place to get data is existing sources. This refers to any data that has already been collected by earlier researchers and is available for future research. Existing resources is an unobtrusive measure that does not disturb the setting or subjects under study. It can include things like census data, newspapers, photography, cultural artifacts. Using existing data is usually less involved than collecting original data and also gives researchers access to distant places and times. Unobtrusive measures limit reactivity, and the tendency of people and events to react to the process of being studied. Reactivity can lead to the Hawthorne effect, where an outcome results from the research setting rather than the independent variable instrument of interest. The Hawthorne effect is in reference to a study done on women working in a sewing factory, and the experimenters were experimenting with changing the variables like the temperature within the room or the light in the area that these ladies were working. And everything they did all created increases in productivity. And the researchers were confounded by this, and ultimately they realized that the ladies knew they were being studied, and every change made them work harder because they thought they would get in trouble if productivity dropped. So it wasn't the changes in the variables, it was the fact that they were being studied that was causing the change. One of the existing resources that you can utilize is something called comparative historical research. This is a type of existing source. It involves an analysis of different regions and time periods. It looks at cultural artifacts such as literature, painting, newspapers, and photographs in its typical type of analysis. An example of existing sources in general to comparative historical research is Anxious Parents, A History of Modern Child Rearing in America by Peter Stearns. Through this book, Stearns shows how the meanings of childhood changed during the 19th and 20th centuries. Experimental methods are another tool that you can use. These are formal tests of specific variables and effects that are performed in a setting where all aspects of the situation can be controlled. Experiments are sometimes difficult to conduct in social settings because it's hard to control every aspect of a social situation, but they can provide valuable insights in how a person might respond in reference to a controlled experiment and then generalize that to an uncontrolled setting. Another thing that we can look at is social network analysis. S&A is used to study the social relationships between two or more individuals. Typically, a questionnaire is used to collect data from respondents. The collected data then can be used to study things like disease transmission or information diffusion or adolescent risk behaviors or corporate behavior, among other issues. Some other issues in sociological research, non-academic uses of research methods are common. The research methods described in this chapter are often applied outside the field of sociology as well. The U.S. Census, political campaign offices, businesses, and market research all fall into this category. Market research is often considered the most common non-academic use of sociological research. An example of this is the case of Whitney Bush in the On the Job box titled Sociology, Market Research, and Design Strategy. So take a look at that example and you'll get a better understanding of what we're talking about.